Welcome to Revolution Chronicles, where we bring you the forgotten echoes of American history. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss our stories tonight. We uncover the haunting tale of Mary Linnett, a woman whose love turned to obsession and whose obsession led to her downfall. Asterisk. The story of Mary Linnett begins quietly, as so many tragedies do in the faded corners of early American life when the roads were still dust in summer and frozen ruts in winter. And when families measured their years by the rhythm of harvests and the ticking of a tall clock in the parlor, she was born in 1842 in a modest farmhouse outside of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, the daughter of a farmer whose hands were always blistered, and a mother who hummed hymns even while scrubbing floors. Mary was the second of 5 children, and from the very beginning, people said there was something about her that was different. She was bright, her eyes sharp and restless, as if always looking for something that no one else could see. Her teacher said she was clever, too quick with her lessons, and always eager to read more than the Bible and the thin school books. But cleverness in a girl was not a prize in those years. It was a weight. And neighbors whispered that Mary's curiosity might get the better of her. She grew up in a house where silence and labor filled most of the days. Her father demanded obedience, her mother demanded grace, and Mary gave them both, but never without a quiet ache. She wanted something more than the small lanes of Lancaster. She wanted to see the wide cities she had read about in the papers, New York and Boston. She wanted to know men who wrote poetry and women who wore silk, and she dreamed often that her life was not her own, but a story waiting to be told. She carried these dreams like a hidden flame, and it was that flame that would later consume Heron. Those days, Lancaster was a place both old and new. It had once been the capital of Pennsylvania. And though the city bustled with taverns and markets, Mary's family lived beyond the bustle on the edge of fields where the only sound at night was the creak of the barn door or the wind through cornstalks. Her world was narrow, and in that narrowness, she turned inward. She was drawn to stories of longing and romance, the kind of books her mother did not approve of. She read Charlotte Brontë and the darker tales of Edgar Allan Poe whenever she could find them at the small lending library in town. Each tale worked its way into her mind, not as mere stories, but as possible futures. She thought herself destined for something dramatic and grand. And in that private conviction, she began to separate from the plain farm life around her. When she was 16, Mary first caught the eye of Thomas Calendar, a tall and broad-shouldered young man who worked at a nearby mill. He was steady and serious, 2 qualities that in any other girl's mind would be a comfort. But in Mary's mind, they were a chain. He courted her in the manner expected, calling on Sundays with his hat in his hand and his eyes lowered. But Mary never warmed to him. Her heart longed not for steadiness, but for fire. Still, her parents encouraged the match. They believed Thomas would offer her security, and security was the closest thing to happiness a woman could expect. But Mary resisted, and though she was polite, she never gave him her hand. Her mother scolded her, telling her she was foolish to let a strong man slip away. But Mary only stared out the window at the road that seemed to stretch to some other world. Was in 1860, just before the war began, that Mary met Henry Linnett, and from the moment she first saw him, she believed he was the answer to all her restless longing. Henry was a traveling salesman, or so he called himself, though in truth he sold little more than trinkets and odds and ends. But he had a way of carrying himself that made him seem worldly. His clothes, though worn, were cut in the fashion of the city. His speech was polished, and he carried stories from Baltimore and Philadelphia as if he were a messenger from another world. To Mary, he seemed like the embodiment of the life she had imagined, and in his presence she felt the flame inside her burst into something she could no longer hide. Henry was older than Mary by nearly 15 years, and to the eyes of her parents, he was not an ideal suitor. He had no farm of his own, no family nearby, and no steady reputation. But Mary's heart, once caught, would not be stilled. She listened to Henry's tales with wide eyes. She believed every word he spoke, And when he told her, she was meant. For more than the dust of Lancaster, she clung to his voice, as though it were Scripture. Henry encouraged her dreams. He told her she had the mind of a poet and the soul of a woman who could rise above her station. Mary, who had long been waiting for someone to see her fire, believed him entirely. The courtship was swift too. Swift for her parents, but Mary was determined. She defied her father's stern words. She ignored her mother's tears, and in the summer of 1861 she left her family home to marry Henry Linnett in a small church by the square. The war had just begun, and the country was filled with unease, but Mary thought only of her own future. She believed she had stepped into the life of passion and grandeur. She had always desired. She believed Henry would carry her into the world of city lights and endless promise, but passion once ignited does not always burn steady, and it was not long before Mary learned the difference between fire that warms and fire that destroys. Henry was charming, but his charm was shallow beneath his polished words. There was a man restless and unreliable. He spent more time away than at home, often gone for weeks, with a promise of business that never seemed to bear fruit. When he returned, he brought gifts, small tokens of glass beads or ribbons, but they were hollow against the reality of their growing debts. Mary found herself in rooms cold with unpaid rent, her belly thin with skipped meals, yet still she clung to Henry. She believed in the image she had built of him, and she would not let the world tell her otherwise. In those lean years, Mary's obsession began to grow. She did not call it that. Not then. She called it love. She called it devotion. But it was something deeper and darker. She told herself that if she gave Henry everything, her patience, her faith, her very soul, then he would become the man she had imagined. She believed she could shape him with her own will, that love could be a force not of comfort, but of transformation. She saw every flaw in him as a challenge to overcome, and every disappointment as a test of her devotion. She began to live not for herself, but for him entirely. Her family saw the change in her when she visited home. Her sisters whispered of her pale cheeks. Her father said little, but his silence carried judgment. Her mother tried to persuade her to come back, but Mary refused. She insisted she was happy, even when her eyes betrayed her words. Henry was the center of her world, and she would not let go. She wore her suffering like a badge of honor, convinced it proved the depth of her love. By 1863, the war had reached every corner of the country, and even Lancaster felt the strain. Henry avoided service through means never fully clear, and some suspected he paid his way out, but Mary defended him with a ferocity that startled even herself. She claimed he was too valuable to risk, that his business kept him from enlisting, and when neighbors muttered otherwise, she turned cold and proud. She began to shut out anyone who doubted him, isolating herself more and more, until her only true companion was Henry himself. Was in this isolation that Mary's obsession deepened from devotion into something perilous. She began to believe Henry was not only her husband, but her destiny, that she was bound to him in a way that could not be broken. She would rise and fall with him. She would share in his triumphs or his ruin, and in her mind there was no life outside of his shadow. She began to justify every cruelty he offered, every absence, every lie. When he came home late with whiskey on his breath, she told herself it was the burden of a man with great troubles. When he shouted or struck the table, she told herself it was passion misdirected, but still passion. When he left for weeks without word, she waited at the window. Her faith unshaken friends tried to intervene, but Mary would not hear of it. She cut off those who spoke ill of Henry. She turned away from her sisters and even from her mother. Her world shrank smaller and smaller, until it was no larger than the space Henry allowed her to occupy. She was consumed by him, and though she did not yet see it, the fire she had nurtured since her youth was no longer her own. It belonged to Henry, and it was burning her away. Their first true fracture came in the spring of 1865, when the war ended and the nation erupted in celebration. Henry returned home with pockets lighter than ever, his business ventures ruined by the chaos of wartime economy. Mary believed that peace would mean a new beginning, but Henry grew restless more than ever. He began to speak of opportunities in distant cities. Richmond, St. Louis, even Chicago. Each plan more ambitious than the last. But none came to fruition. Money grew scarce, and so did Patience's neighbors. Whispered that Henry was a fraud, a drifter living on charm and borrowed coin, but Mary defended him with a fire that shocked even those who pitied. She declared that he was misunderstood, that the world did not recognize his worth. She clung tighter the more he slipped away. And it was then that Mary's obsession took its final shape. It was no longer about love or even hope. It was about survival. She could not imagine herself without Henry. To lose him would be to lose her very self, so she told herself she would hold him no matter the cost, no matter the sacrifice. She would cling to him, even if it meant losing everything else. And in that vow, unspoken but burning within her, Mary Linnett set her life upon a path from which she could never return. The years after the war brought changes across the country, but for Mary Linnett, those changes carried little of the promise she had once imagined. America was pushing forward, railroads spreading like veins across the land, factories rising in smoky towns and cities, swelling with new life. But in Mary's small rented rooms, the future looked only like more waiting, more hoping, more disappointment. Henry promised her again and again that fortune was just ahead. He spoke of deals to be made, partnerships waiting to be sealed, but the coins in Mary's hand grew fewer and fewer, and her dresses grew thin at the elbows. At first, Mary bore it with the same steadfast devotion she had shown before she sold her own belongings. Piece by piece, the brooch her mother had given her, the quilt sewn by her grandmother, the few books she had clung to since girlhood, all went to keep them afloat. She told herself it was temporary, that Henry was meant for greatness, and she must sacrifice now so that later she might rise with him. But the later never came, and still she waited. She waited as days folded into years, and the sharp edges of her youthful dreams dulled into an ache that never lifted. Henry, for his part, grew restless in his own way. He was a man who could not sit still long enough to plant roots. He drifted from scheme to scheme. A shipment of tobacco bound for Baltimore that never arrived. A partnership with a man in Philadelphia that dissolved into nothing. A promised shop in Richmond that never opened. Each failure left them poorer, but Henry always had another plan, and Mary always believed him, because to doubt him would be to doubt the meaning of her life, and she would not let herself do that. The neighbors noticed, of course they always did. Lancaster was a place where people measured each other's fortunes with sharp eyes and quiet tongues. Mary and Henry became a subject of murmured pity. She had been a pretty girl, they said, with a bright future. But she had bound herself to a man who gave her nothing but promises. Some said she was foolish. Others said she was bewitched. A few even whispered darker things, that perhaps she had lost her mind. But Mary did not hear them. She walked through the market with her head high. Though her basket was often nearly empty, she defended Henry at every turn, her voice sharp against any suggestion that he was less than she believed. Her family, too, had begun to withdraw. Her sisters no longer visited, as they once had. Her father, who had always been stern, grew colder still. He declared that Mary had chosen her path, and he would not waste his breath trying to turn her back. Only her mother clung to her with a soft kind of sorrow, begging her in letters to come home, reminding her that there would always be a place at the farm. But Mary refused. She told her mother that her life was with Henry, and that she could not abandon him, even when her hands trembled as she wrote the words. She clung to her choice with the stubbornness of a drowning soul clinging to driftwood. The 1870s came. Henry's ventures grew more desperate, and with them Mary's obsession deepened. He began to gamble, not only with cards but with trust. He borrowed money he could not repay. He promised favors he could not deliver. He came home at hours that stretched into dawn, smelling of whiskey and smoke, sometimes cheerful with wild stories, sometimes silent and brooding, and sometimes sharp with anger. Mary endured it all. She told herself that she told herself that men carried burdens differently, that his temper was only the shadow of his greatness. She convinced herself that each failure was a step toward success, that all she needed to do was hold on a little longer. But the years wore on, and Mary's life became a kind of prison, a prison not of bars but of love, twisted into chains. She woke each morning not for herself, but to measure Henry's moods. She planned her days around his absences. She spent her nights waiting for his footsteps on the stair. Her own desires faded until there was nothing left but him. She no longer dreamed of cities or poetry. She no longer longed for silks or candlelit parlors. She wanted only for Henry to stay, for Henry to love her as she loved him. But even that small hope was always out of reach. It was during these years that Mary's appearance began to change. Once she had been known for her lively eyes and quick smile, but now her eyes were ringed with shadows, and her mouth set more often in silence. Her body thinned from too many missed meals, and her clothes hung loose. Her beauty faded not only from hardship, but from the consuming fire inside her. For obsession eats more than time, it eats the spirit, and though she could not see it, the woman she had once been was slipping away. Henry, meanwhile, seemed untouched by the ruin around them. He still carried himself with the same charms, still spoke with the same confidence, as though tomorrow would always deliver what today did not. He leaned on Mary's devotion, knowing it would not falter. He used her faith as a shield against the world, and though he gave little in return, he held her fast, not out of love but out of convenience, for in Mary he found someone who would always believe, someone who would never let go. There were moments, though, when even Mary felt the cracks in her faith. There were nights when she lay awake, listening to the empty rooms around her, and wondered if she had been wrong, if Henry was not the man she had believed. But when dawn came and he smiled at her with that old charm, she pushed the doubts away. She could not bear them, for doubt would mean her whole life had been a lie, and that was a truth she could not face. She clung harder each time her heart faltered, binding herself tighter to him with every disappointment. By 1875, their fortunes had sunk so low that they were forced to leave Lancaster altogether. Henry claimed there was nothing left for him there, that new opportunities awaited in the city. Mary followed without hesitation. They moved east, first to Philadelphia, where they lived in small rooms above a tavern, then later to Baltimore. Each move promised a fresh start. Each move delivered only more debt and more loneliness. Mary wandered unfamiliar streets with a sense of dislocation, as though she were a shadow passing through a world that was not her own. She had left behind the fields and lanes of her childhood, but found no belonging in the crowded alleys of the city. Her only anchor was Henry, and Henry was always slipping away. In Baltimore, Henry became entangled with men of questionable reputation, gamblers, con men, men who spoke in whispers and carried knives. Mary never knew the full truth of his dealings, but she sensed the danger. She saw the bruises on his knuckles, the sudden silences when certain names were spoken. Still, she asked no questions. She believed it was her duty to stand by him, no matter what. She told herself that her love was a shield strong enough to withstand anything, but in truth, it was only binding her more tightly to his ruin. It was during this time that Mary's health began to falter. She grew thin to the point of frailty. Her cough lingered, her hands shook, yet she pressed on. She worked when she could, taking in sewing for a few coins. She pawned the last of her possessions, even her wedding ring once when the rent was due, but she never complained. Not aloud. Her suffering became part of her devotion, proof of the depth of her love. She told herself that no other woman could endure what she endured, and that in enduring she was securing Henry's future. She began to believe her suffering was the very purpose of her life. By the late 1870s, the cracks that had long been forming began to widen. Henry grew more distant, more reckless. He disappeared for longer stretches, returned with darker moods. Mary, who had once believed she could shape him with her love, now found herself shaped by his absence. Her days became empty hours of case. Her days became empty hours of convert lever conserves. Mel skews and levers fared, and leaves a rich, long-lasting color. Mary, who had one lasting color. Mary, who had once last, said as fall made well. Melly said so lies tree silent. Me slast, we said K. We said itself so inside. Comed, my lads, we abuse sived, but to be I call it have. Doc head siv I sick said, you can since it's gaga to sue it kabase it kid to be lee creek go I lived sick at it to cly we to put the rees of the kid say it to put the this to be to get to the be it assistance put Waiting her night's restless vigils by the window, she no longer lived for herself. She no longer lived at all. She existed only in relation to Henry. Her every thought bound to his presence or his absence, she was consumed entirely and. Then one night, in 1879, Henry did not return at all. Mary waited first with patience, then with worry, then with fear. She asked around the taverns, she haunted the streets, she even wrote. Two men she barely knew, but Henry was gone whether he had fled or fallen. She never learned. All she knew was that the center of her life had vanished, and with it her reason for living. She returned to their small room and sat by the window night after night, hoping for his shadow to appear on the street below, but the days stretched into weeks and the weeks into months, and still he did not come. The absence hollowed her. She no longer ate, she no longer spoke, she drifted through the days like a ghost. Neighbors pitied her. Some tried to help, but she turned them away. She would not hear that Henry had abandoned her. She told herself he would return, that he must return. She believed it so fiercely that she ignored all evidence to the contrary. Her obsession, which had once bound her to him in life, now bound her to his absence. In death of the spirit, she could not let go. She could not live, and she could not die. She could only wait. No me tand. In that endless waiting, Mary Linnett began her final descent, for obsession does not release its hold even when the object of it is gone. It lingers, it consumes, and it destroys, and Mary clung to it with the last shreds of her fading strength. The months after Henry's disappearance were a long unraveling of Mary Linnett's soul. She clung to the thought of him with a fierceness that frightened even those who pitied her. She insisted that he had not abandoned her, that he was delayed by some twist of fortune, that he would appear at the door with explanations and with promises renewed each day. She prepared herself for his return. She kept a chair waiting by the fire. She folded and refolded his shirts. She even set aside food she could barely afford to buy, but he never came, and the silence of his absence grew heavier until it pressed against her chest like a weight she could not lift at. First, the neighbors tried to help. A kindly woman from across the hall brought her broth. Another offered work. A man who ran the tavern downstairs offered to carry her letters to any address she wished. But Mary would not hear of it. She told them Henry would be home soon. She told them he would set everything right. She wore her conviction like armor, though behind her eyes a tremor of fear flickered. The neighbors pitied her, but pity fades, and soon they began to mutter that she was not right in her mind. Some said she had been deserted, others whispered she had been cursed, and still others said she was mad, but Mary paid them no heed. She shut her door against the world and sat by the window watching through the long winter of 1879. She wasted away. Her body, already frail, grew weaker still. She ate little, she slept less. Her cough worsened, yet she clung to her vigil. Sometimes she spoke aloud to the empty room, speaking as though Henry sat beside her. She told him of her day. She told him of her devotion. She told him she had never doubted, never would doubt. The sound of her voice in the silence made the room seem haunted. And in truth, it was haunted not by spirits, but by her own consuming obsession. By spring of 1880, the room had grown so bare it seemed almost abandoned. The furniture sold, the curtains gone. Only possessions left were those tied to Henry, a pair of worn boots, his razor, a hat he had once tossed carelessly on the chair. She guarded them as though they were relics of a saint. She would not part with them, no matter how hungry she became. She stroked the worn leather of his boots as though they might answer her touch. She pressed her face into the old fabric of his coat, breathing in a scent long since faded, and told herself it was proof he would return. But he did not return, and Mary's mind, which had once burned with restless dreams, grew clouded by shadows. She began to lose her grip on time. The days slipped into one another. She could no longer tell Sunday from Wednesday morning from night. She thought she heard Henry's voice in the hallway. She thought she saw his figure at the edge of her vision. Once she even opened the door, certain he was there, but only. The draft swept in, and she shut it again with trembling hands. She told herself she was not mad. She told herself it was faith, but faith had become a fever, and it burned through her like fire. Mother wrote often, still begging her to come home, but the letters piled unread. Mary told herself that if she left, Henry would not know where to find her. She believed with all her being that he would return to that very room, and if she was gone, he would be lost again. She chained herself to that place as surely as if it were a cell. The years stretched on, and still she waited, her once bright eyes now hollow, her once graceful hands now thin and shaking. Those years, the world outside changed, the country raced into the Gilded Age. Fortunes were made in steel and oil. Railroads stitched the states together. New inventions lit city streets with electric light, but Mary saw none of it. She lived in a shadowed room, her world no wider than the window through which she watched for a man who would never come. She had once longed to be part of a grand story, and she had indeed become part of one, but it was a story not of triumph, but of ruin. It was in the summer of 1882 that a young doctor newly arrived in Baltimore was summoned by a neighbor who feared Mary might die alone. He found her seated by the window, as always, thin as a wisp, her skin pale and drawn, her cough ragged. She resisted his questions, speaking instead of Henry, with a glow in her eyes that frightened him. She told the doctor Henry would return soon, that she must be ready. The doctor tried to explain gently that Henry might never come, but she cut him off, her voice sharp. For the first time in years, she told him he did not understand, that her life was bound to Henry's, that to speak otherwise was a sin. The doctor left shaken, telling the neighbors she was beyond his help, that her illness was not of the body alone, but of the mind. And so Mary remained year after year, her body growing weaker, her mind ever more consumed by the single thought of Henry's return. She became known in the building as the woman who waited. Children whispered about her as they passed the door, saying she was a ghost already. Some said she was a warning, others said she was cursed. But Mary paid no mind. She had long since ceased to care what the world thought. She lived only in her devotion. By the mid-1880s, her story had reached even back to Lancaster. A cousin who visited Baltimore wrote home of her state. The family was torn. Her sisters believed she was lost beyond saving. Her father, long since hardened, said she had made her bed and must lie in it, but her mother still prayed each night for her daughter to be delivered from her obsession. The prayers went unanswered, and Mary remained where she was, waiting, always waiting. There was a moment in 1887 when Henry Linnett's name was whispered again. He had been seen, some said, in New York, others said Chicago. Tales drifted through the taverns and boarding houses, but whether true or false, Mary never knew. She never left her room to seek him. She told herself he would come to her, that he must come to her, for had she not given everything, had she not proven her devotion beyond doubt? She convinced herself it was only a matter of time. But time is merciless, and by 1890, Mary was no longer young. She was 48 years old, though she looked far older, her hair streaked with gray, her hands twisted with age and hardship, her body frail as paper yet. Still she sat by the window, still she spoke softly to the empty room, still she clung to The boots, the hat, the coat, as though they were holy relics, she had become a monument to her own obsession, a figure frozen in grief, and longing neighbors came and went, families moved in and out, children grew up and left, yet Mary remained always the same, her life, a circle with no end. Her devotion unbroken, her ruin complete. She was spoken of less with pity and more with fear. For there is something unsettling in a love that outlives reason, something unnatural in a devotion that endures. Beyond hope, in the last years of her life, Mary scarcely left the chair by the window. Her cough left her weak, her legs could no longer carry her far. She survived on the charity of a few neighbors who left bread or broth at her door. She rarely ate more than a few bites, she rarely spoke more than a few words, yet her eyes never left the window, and when asked why she waited, she always answered, "The same, he is coming home." So the seasons turned, the years slipped by, and Mary Linnett faded. Slowly, like a candle burning itself away, she had given her life to an obsession that never gave back. She had poured her soul into a blessé, a man who had vanished, and in doing so, she had vanished herself. She had once dreamed of greatness, of a story to be told, and in a way she had achieved it. But it was a story of ruin, a story of how love, when twisted into obsession, can consume a life until nothing remains. In the winter of 1894, the neighbors realized they had not seen her at the window for several days. The door was knocked, but no answer came at last. It was forced open, and there she was, still seated in her chair by the window, her body still, her eyes closed, her hands resting on the worn coat she had clutched for years. Mary Linnett was gone. At last, freed not by choice but by death from the obsession that had destroyed her, word spread quickly through the building, and then, through the neighborhood, people spoke in hushed tones of the woman who had waited. Her story carried a strange power. Some felt pity, others felt unease, still others felt anger that she had wasted her life so completely, but all agreed it was a tale they would not forget. She had become a cautionary figure, a reminder that love, when it becomes all-consuming, can be more deadly than hate. Her body was buried quietly in a churchyard with no family present, save for a distant cousin who came out of Titi. Her grave was marked with a simple stone, her name and dates, nothing more. No mention of Henry, no mention of the life she had wasted waiting. She lay in the earth at last at peace, though her spirit had known no peace in life. And Henry Linnett, the man for whom she had given everything, was never heard of again. Some said he died in a tavern fight in New York, others that he fled west under another name. Perhaps he lived a long life, perhaps he did not. But whatever his fate, he carried with him the ghost of Mary Linnett, for her life had been bound to his in a way he never returned, and she never escaped. The story of Mary Linnett might have ended with her burial in that quiet churchyard in 1894, but in truth it lingered like a shadow across the years. Those who had known her in Lancaster or in Baltimore carried her memory with them, and they spoke of her not as one speaks of a neighbor who has passed, but as one speaks of a warning, a figure half real and half ghost. She became part of the whispered lore of her time, a name spoken in low tones when mothers warned their daughters against giving too much of themselves, or when old men at taverns spoke of lives lost to folly. Lancaster, her story returned with particular force. Her cousins repeated it to the next generation, painting her as a woman undone by passion. Some softened the tale, saying she had loved too much. Others sharpened it, saying she had been a fool who wasted the gifts God had given her. Still others said she was cursed, that some dark fate had taken hold of her when she was still a girl, staring out across the dusty road, longing for more than she was meant to have. Whatever version was told, it always ended the same. She had been destroyed, not by violence, not by disease, not by accident, but by her own consuming obsession. It is easy in the distance of years to shake our heads and say she should have known better, that she should have walked away when Henry first showed himself to be unreliable, that she should have returned to the farm when her mother begged her, that she should have listened to the whispers Of her own heart when doubt crept in, but life does not often unfold in such clean choices. It is lived in moments of hope, in moments of fear, in small bargains we make with ourselves to endure another day. Mary did not wake one morning and choose destruction. She chose love, she chose faith, she chose devotion, and by inches those choices bound her until she could not break free. What destroyed her was not a single act, but the slow, relentless grip of obsession. And it is there that her story finds its most haunting truth. For obsession is not so foreign to us as we may wish to believe. It lies close to love, close to hope, close to the dreams that give us meaning. It begins in the warmth of affection, in the glow of belief, and only later shows its darker face. Mary Linnett's life was consumed not by hatred, not by cruelty, but by her refusal to let go of the vision she carried. Of Henry, of herself, of the life she thought she deserved. She clung to it long after it had slipped beyond her grasp, and in clinging she lost everything else. When we look at the photographs of the 1800s, those stern faces, those unsmiling portraits, we see people who appear so distant, so unlike ourselves, yet beneath the stiff collars and the heavy dresses, they felt the same longings, the same fears, the same desperate need to be seen, to be loved. Mary was no different. She was a woman of her time, yet also timeless. She wanted more than the narrow world into which she was born. She wanted passion. She wanted meaning, and in Henry, she thought she had found it. Perhaps that is why her story lingers still, because we can recognize in her something of ourselves, the dangerous closeness between love and seer. My love and seer might serve. My love and obsession. After her death, her room was cleared by neighbors. What they found was little more than a few pieces of furniture and the relics of Henry's life, the coat worn thin, the boots cracked with age, the razor rusted from years of disuse. These were the treasures she had guarded with her last breath. They were given away or thrown out in time, and so the physical trace of Henry Linnett vanished from the world. Yet the memory of Mary remained stronger than any relic. Her story told again and again, until it became part of the fabric of local memories. Some even claimed her spirit lingered. There were stories in Baltimore of a pale woman seen at a window long after her death, of footsteps in the hallway where no one lived, of a voice whispering Henry's name in the quiet hours of night. Such tales are common enough in old cities where every brick carries some sorrow. But in Mary's case, the tales held a particular chill because those who told them knew her life. They knew she had waited by that window year after year. And so the thought that she might still be waiting, even in death, carried a certain terrible plausibility. Yet perhaps the truest ghost of Mary Linnett is not a specter at a window, but the echo of her choices in the lives of those who hear her story. For every generation faces its own temptations, its own promises of love or fortune that may not be what they seem. Her story reminds us how easy 'tis to lose ourselves in devotion to another, how easy it is to believe that love means sacrifice without end, and how hard it is to see when that sacrifice has become destruction. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world had moved on. New inventions, new wars, new sorrows, and new hopes. Mary Linnett's grave lay quiet, her name forgotten by most, yet the few who remembered told her story to their children, and those children passed it on, so that even now, more than a century later, her name rises again as we tell it here. Her life and her ruin brought back to light, not for pity, not for scorn, but as a reminder. For in her story lies a lesson about the fragility of the human heart, about the way dreams can turn against us if we hold them too tightly, about the danger of mistaking obsession for love. Mary Linnett was a woman of her age, and yet her downfall is as modern as any tragedy we might witness today in the newspapers or in the quiet homes where people suffer unseen. She stands as a figure both historical and eternal, a young girl who dreamed too fiercely, a woman who loved too completely, and a soul who could not let go. And so when we close the tale of Mary Linnett, we are left with more than men The image of a woman at a window, we are left with a question, one that lingers longer than the facts of her life. What is the line between devotion and destruction, between faith and folly, between love and obsession? Mary did not see that line until it was far behind her, and by then she could not. Returning the end, her life was not measured by what she gained, but by what she gave away, piece by piece, until nothing remained. She gave her youth, she gave her health, she gave her family, her friends, her dignity, her hope, and finally she gave her very self, all to an obsession that did not return her devotion. It is a story as old as time and as near as tomorrow, a story that asks us to look at our own hearts and wonder what fires we are feeding and what they might one day consume. Linnett lies in a forgotten grave, her name worn on a stone weathered by years, but her story endures as long as it is told. It endures because it is not only her story, it is the story of longing, of love turned inward until it devours the one who holds it. It is a story that speaks to the fragility of the human soul and to the dangerous beauty of desire unchecked. We tell it not to condemn her, but to remember that even in the quiet corners of American history, there are lives that burn with such intensity they cannot be forgotten, perhaps somewhere beyond the veil where suffering is ended and all truths are revealed. Mary Linnett has at last found peace. Perhaps she has found the Henry she sought. Perhaps she has learned to let go at last. We cannot know, but what we can know is this: her life stands as a solemn reminder that obsession, no matter how noble it may seem, can destroy as surely as any weapon or any war. Her name remains not as a footnote, but as a punch note, but as a warning, the story of a woman who loved too much and in doing so lost herself. This, then, is the fatal obsession of Mary Linnett, a tale from the old American past, told not with judgment, but with sorrow and with reverence for the fragility of the human heart. Her window is long since gone, her room long since emptied, yet her story remains. And through it, she still waits, not for Henry, not for fortune, but for us to remember, to listen, and perhaps to learn.